Good afternoon. My name is Candida Steele, and I'm retired as a judge on the U.S. Civilian Board of Contract Appeals, and I live in Maine.
I'm Steve Frenzik. I'm a retired professor of political science from the U.S. Naval Academy.
I'm Lindsay Draper. By the way, there's an army of people on the gal. I'm sorry. I'm retired from the juvenile court bench here in Milwaukee County, Wisconsin.
And could you tell us who you are, please?
Good afternoon. We are Reno High School's Unit 6. We are happy to be here with you today. We are coming to you live from the University of Nevada, Reno. My name is Zoe Keeley-Busboom, and I'm going to University of Utah this fall.
Good afternoon. My name is Marissa Sandoval, and I will be attending New York University.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Andrews, and I will be attending the University of Utah in the fall.
Good afternoon. My name is Drew Tilbrook, and I will be attending the University of Denver this fall. Our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark, and our unit coach is Mr. Denny Martindale.
Great. And we're going to be doing question number 1. And so that everybody else on the Zoom call here knows what we're doing, I will read it for the record, and we're being recorded. So as Benjamin Lincoln wrote to Daniel Shays, quote, "Disband your deluded followers. Should you attempt to fire upon the troops of government, the consequences might be fatal to many of your men the least guilty. What useful purposes, if any, have rebellions served throughout American history? Do the events of January 6, 2021 at the US Capitol constitute a rebellion? Why or why not? Are there rebellions in the world today that are justified? Why or why not? You may begin."
We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. As Martin Luther King Jr. explained in his letter from a Birmingham jail, rebellions are symptoms of systemic problems that forge turning points in society to cultivate change. Black's Law Dictionary defines rebellion as a deliberate, organized resistance by force and arms to the laws or operations of the government.
Rebellions form when government breaks the social contract it established with its citizens. In the United States, that contract is laid out in the Constitution's preamble. The government and the people have the responsibility to ensure domestic tranquility and promote the general welfare. The justification for rebellion is detailed in the Declaration of Independence. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it.
The United States was a nation founded on rebellion during the Revolutionary War. In 1787, Daniel Shays led a rebellion against unfair taxes and money circulation. Shays' rebellion showed the insufficiency of the Articles of Confederation and sparked the Constitutional Convention, inspiring the U.S. Constitution's inclusion of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, giving Congress the ability to tax and pay domestic debt. Shays' rebellion facilitated America's turning point from state to federal power.
However, rebellions can reach farther than government and have cultivated fundamental change in the workforce. In 1877, the B&O Railroad cut wages 3 times in 1 year, causing a violent rebellion that stalled the economy. The rebellion lasted 69 days until broken up by federal troops. Following the labor rebellion, there was a growth of union membership, positive public approval, and equity in the workforce. The events of January 6th were a rebellion, but an unjustified one, using violence to overturn the 2020 election results during the Senate certification, a process outlined in the Constitution. The rioters violated Section 2383 under Title 18 of the United States Code, which prohibits incitement, assistance, and participation in a rebellion or insurrection against the United States.
January 6th was a direct attack on the nation's principles and was built on hyperpartisanship and disinformation, encouraged by President Donald Trump claiming he won on election night. The rebellion inspired a negative turning point, with attacks on elections and voting rights. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, more than 440 restrictive voting bills were introduced in the 2021 legislative session, and 19 states passed 34 laws using the Constitution's election clause in Article 1, Section 4, Clause 1.
Myanmar's military forced another turning point after ousting civilian leader Suu Kyi last year, and citizens turned to violent rebellion against the authoritarian government. Myanmar's rebellion is a justified reaction as the people attempt to reinstate democracy. The military has seen thousands of defections, and per the Center for International Studies, the longer this goes on, the more it favors opposition forces, signaling a slow but significant turning point back towards democracy.
In January 2022, energy prices doubled overnight in Kazakhstan, causing violent protests that turned into a justified rebellion. Rebels signified the people's discontent with decades-long authoritarianism and wealth inequality. After deeming public protests illegal without a permit, President Tokayev authorized security forces to fire without warning and blocked social media platforms. By criminalizing protesters' rights, the Kazakh government left citizens no choice but to rebel and force a turning point to political liberalization.
As abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote in 1866, the thing worse than rebellion is the thing that causes rebellion. Rebellions happen for a reason and continue to birth some of the most foundational turning points in both American and world history. Regardless of their success, societies must learn from rebellions and adapt, or fall victim to the very problems that cause them. Thank you.
Well done. Good timing. Thank you very much. So do you think Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is implicated in the events of January 6th?
Section
Yes.
14 of the 14th, or Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is absolutely part of the insurrection on January 6th. And if the January 6th committee finds that President Trump had a part to do with the January 6th insurrection and instigated it, then they could follow out with the 14th Amendment, Section 3.
And the third section of the 14th Amendment has been extremely relevant in recent news. As we saw, Madison Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene both were implicated under this part of the Constitution, and both went through trial, or Marjorie Taylor Greene is currently in a trial trying to figure out if she is actually ineligible for office.
Some legal experts have argued, however, that the 14th Amendment, or Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, actually has no teeth unless Congress makes enforcement provisions under Section 5 of that. So ultimately, while these cases of Madison Cawthorn and Marjorie Taylor Greene are being handled at a state level, ultimately Congress would have to make provisions to decide whether to expel them from their positions.
Put yourself in the position of the most extreme of the demonstrators on January 6th and talk a little bit about how they might justify their behavior to their children and their grandchildren.
These protesters believed that they were in a rebellion and that their rights were being infringed on because the Senate certification was happening and that the election was fraudulent. They believed that they were in a rebellion, as Ali Alexander, the head of the Stop the Steal organization, tweeted at 1:13 a.m. of January 6th that this was the first day of the rebellion.
Following our idea of the justification of a rebellion, which is following John Locke's idea of your natural rights, of life, liberty, and property, after going through civil measures, these protesters probably believed that their civil measures had already been worked out and that hadn't worked, so they believed that a rebellion was justified. But as we can see, the rebellion was not justified because it was not based in truth or facts.
And we also define what a justified rebellion is by the perspective. Another rebellion that we see was in the Civil War. Seeing that Dred Scott determined slaves to be property, and after the United States outlawed slavery, the South saw this as taking away their right to their property. As William Rawls found, an American lawyer found, having your property taken away from you is a justified reason to secede. So we see, from the perspective of the South, the Civil War was a justified rebellion. And as we saw with the January 6th rioters, from their perspective, they also felt that they were justified in what they were doing.
And on that last point, I find it interesting that you ended with the quote that you did. The only thing worse than rebellion are the things that cause them. January 6th struck me as being some people lost, that the candidate they wanted to win didn't win, but instead of accepting that, they decided to act like children and pout. So I want you to connect the quote that you gave, the things that caused them, with what actually happened. Can you connect that for me?
Sorry, I apologize for interrupting, but these people believed because that their things that was happening was bad, and this is a symptom of the epidemic of hyperpartisanship and misinformation we are seeing. President Donald Trump said that these people must fight and they must fight like hell or they will not have a country anymore. And so by this precedent, they believed that if they did not protest or rebel, then their country would not be standing anymore.
The misinformation is one of the many things that led to the January 6th insurrection. We can see this specifically in the COVID-19 pandemic, as different politicians had different political beliefs, and it was a mass spread of misinformation, as President Donald Trump didn't even put a mask mandate in place until October of 2020.
January 6th was also stoked by ambiguities in the Electoral Count Act. Elected leaders like President Trump and also his attorney, John Eastman, used these ambiguities to imply that Vice President Mike Pence, as president of the Senate, could reject the slate of electors that day. And so one of the most important things we can do going forward is have bipartisan reform of the Electoral Count Act and streamline this process outlined in Article 2, Section 1, Clauses 2 and 3.
How
Thank
can
you.
we go about changing government or altering government beyond rebellion or without rebellion?
As we can see, if we're going to want to change aspects of the government, people can protest. As we saw with the civil rights movement, this was nonviolent protests that were actually successful. And if there were violence, it was instigated by the police, as we can see with the Children's March.
Another way that has been seen in the past was during the women's suffrage movement to get the passing of the 19th Amendment. And this was done through peaceful methods of peaceful protest, writing to policymakers, and even some women handcuffed themselves to the White House gates.
Another form of extreme direct action that was taken very recently was a man from Colorado immolated himself outside of the Supreme Court on Earth Day in response to the US government's lack of action on climate change and the court's hearing on an EPA ruling.
Well, that's a little extreme. I hope that that doesn't end up being the best way to go about such things. But how do you think such events as those that took place on January 6th can be prevented?
One of the most important ways we can fix what happened on January 6th is increasing the amount of truth in our news. According to the Pew Research Center, 35% of Americans get all of their news from Facebook, and a Princeton poll found Facebook to be the fastest spreader of fake news. So limiting the power that these social media companies have to spread false rumors and unfair and false news is a major way that we could fix another January 6th from happening again.
Another way, oh, sorry.
You.
Okay. Another way we could do this is the January 6th stream from the fact that many of these protesters do not understand elections and the Constitution and election process. This can be fixed by having new voters learning about how to vote and the Constitution before they are even turning 18 and eligible to vote. This can be fixed by creating a civics class, or having, like in Nevada, we currently have a full year, but are being reduced next year to half a year, but it should be instilled to a full year instead permanently.
As President Eisenhower remarked, if a political party does not have its foundation in the determination to advance a cause that is right and that is moral, then it is not a political party. It is merely a conspiracy to seize power. And that is why the Republican Party must reform itself. The Republican Party can adopt an open primary system and a ranked choice voting system in order to prevent far-right and small d democratic candidates from rising to power in the first place.
So
Go ahead.
in a world in which you can I can get my news from anybody I want to who's going to say what I believe. I can go to exactly the person I want. How are we ever going to get the truth? I mean, I'm not sure that anybody believes there is an objective truth anymore. How do we get that to people?
Getting the idea of an objective truth first can be done following my colleague's idea of introducing the civics class by having people examine the idea of what exactly the news is and how to find that truth. Another way that we can do it in present day is examining the several sources that we have. So not just taking information from the New York Times or the Atlantic, but looking at all the information provided.
And along with this, specific education has been created to identify false news. In a study by the Reboot Foundation, it was found that showing a child a short video or having them read a short article on how to identify false news had an immediate effect on how accurate or how they could pick out which news sources or stories were accurate. So introducing this into our typical education, but also allowing other adults to see this is another way of allowing people to find that objective truth by themselves.
And
Yeah.
since social, sorry.
I say in this realm, under what conditions should government limit free speech?
We saw in Brandenburg versus Ohio, for example, that the government could limit free speech under the First Amendment if it was intended and did produce imminent lawless action, for example. So the obvious example being shouting fire in a crowded theater.
Along with this, the FCC has various regulations speaking on whether they are allowed to regulate free speech. Certain regulations, may I finish? Certain regulations they have prevent them from censoring or limiting the free speech of anybody, but they also have a regulation that states that it is illegal for news sources to intentionally distort the news. So we believe they should act more on this certain regulation to prevent distortion of the news.
Wouldn't that be great? Fantastic. Great job. Steve, you want to start?
Okay. Well, I thought you did an excellent job. I did like the fact you brought in the COVID stuff. You're not going to waste all that research you did, and you were able to fit that in effectively, and it fit. So it was useful. I thought your reasoning was good in terms of consequences of one kind or another. But overall, I thought you did an excellent job.
Thank you.
Great. Lindsay?
So several real quick things. First of all, I've got to go back because I obviously missed something. The immolation, I missed that.
Yes, I did
know
too.
that happened. I've got to go read.
Paper this morning.
I'm not going to paying attention. You know, I always get excited about judging this competition because I deal with young people who, you know, you all are so optimistic and you see the world in such nice, I like you all. And part of what I'm talking about is you actually think that most of those people on January 6th voted and they saw their votes not being taken. Bless your hearts, because you think they did. There's no part of me that believes that. I think it was much more important to start some stuff than to actually get out and do the constructive thing that our country was built on. You talked about, oh, by the way, and the fact that you brought up the Brenda Center for Justice, good, because that's another of the sources I think are important. I liked your international examples. I liked the references you made to the labor rebellion. You did a lot of, I don't want to say exactly outside the box, but you talked, because I don't hear people talk about President Eisenhower a whole lot in the competition. But this really was so enjoyable, and you all are to be commended. And say hi to Kathleen Dickinson for me. Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
she'll have heard you. Great. That was really a terrific job. Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Starting out with freedom is never easy, is a good thing to start with. I appreciated your answers on my 14th Amendment question. You might not have heard that, in fact, there were also 3 lawsuits filed against 3 Arizona congressmen that I think also have been set aside. But it still is an interesting issue. And the fact that there haven't been many precedents, I think probably has a lot to do with why everybody's iffy about whether or not it's going to get anywhere. But I definitely appreciated that. Your international exhibits were excellent. And I think mostly you demonstrated that all of you know very much what you're talking about, and you did a really nice job of peeling the onion. I mean, the very next question we had, you showed another idea. I mean, you obviously know a great deal more than you've told us, and I find that really thrilling because I hope it has inspired you enough to stick with your interest in political science and the news and what's going on and your responsibility as a citizen. And I hope that you'll end up to use this experience to influence your friends and family to educate themselves about what their responsibilities are and to use their vote wisely. But I also think we need to rely on your generation to take the place of those people who are currently in Congress and in government, and that you might think about representing the rest of us, because boy, do we need people who know as much as you do to be in government. And I have to, I've noted many times in these hearings that people, and you're a wonderful example of it, people who know so much more about the Constitution than anyone in my law school classes knew. So, and you're in high school. So I'm deeply impressed with the presentation you've made, and I hope you've had a wonderful time, and congratulations.
Thank you so much. We really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
Thank you.